I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education in Atlanta, Georgia, and Emeritus professor of Middle Eastern history and political science at Emory. This is the 10th webinar we've had in our series since the attack on October 7th. Today's title is Israel's 9/11, Reporting from the Homefront, Observations of Reporters on the Ground in Israel. We hope you learn from the insights of the guests. We post our materials on our Center for Israel Education website, israeled.org. It enjoys more than 40,000 viewers per week. We have no peer across the globe in providing timely analysis of modern Israel, its history and politics. We touch on culture, Israel identity, diaspora Israel relations, Israel art, literature, politics. We use sources in Hebrew, Arabic, and German. We focus on young adults, college students, and those other people who are otherwise known as lifelong learners. We're an independent 501c3 that exists because users and listeners like you support what we're doing. Acquiring content about context allows for rational perspective. To date, the webinars have engaged more than 24 of the best and brightest scholars, analysts, diplomats, and today journalists in shedding light on this most unanticipated and unexpected war. Our previous webinars are archived. We're going to continue the webinars because they become an analytical capsule of very bright people who are following this on a weekly basis. As time passes, the brutality of October 7th recedes into Israel's response. We are fortunate to be joined by these three journalists today. TV correspondent Nicole Zedeck of I-24, reporting on the Middle East since February. A freelance reporter, Michele Chabin, with experience reporting in and about Israel going back to 1987, just before the outbreak of the first Intifada. And Hillel Kuttler, living through his first war since moving from Baltimore to Israel, also a freelance journalist. Since Hamas viciously killed more than 1,200 Israelis and unleashed brutal attacks on the residents in 20 or so locations around Gaza and took 240 hostages, the global focus has increasingly turned to the situation in Gaza as Israel tries to destroy Hamas as a political and military entity. The war has had profound effects within Israel amid continuing rocket attacks, mass evacuations, military call-ups, advocacy for the hostages, and pending and long-lasting grief for those who died since October 7th. The war unfolded after a half a year of domestic protests going on in Israel that sought to change Israeli governance. And the 9 weeks since October 7th, Israeli society, to say the least, has been jolted, just as the war with Hamas in Gaza has turned that enclave on its head and had broad international and regional impacts. To start off, I'd like to ask you, Nicole, you started reporting relatively recently. How did October 7th have an impact upon you as the new learning reporter and what your expectations were to being a reporter in Israel?
I am not a war correspondent. I have not been a war correspondent. Even before reporting in Israel since February, I was working in local news in the United States. That's very different than reporting in the Middle East. But I always knew I wanted to be in the Middle East and provide a voice for exactly what is happening, because it is such a complex situation. I've learned a lot since February, but I don't think anything could have prepared me for what happened on October 7th, because no one was prepared for what happened on October 7th. This is one of the largest news stories to happen in the entire region. This is the second independence war, some people are saying. So absolutely, as big as this is for my short career so far, this is some of the biggest thing that's been happening for people's entire lives. And I think with that comes a lot of responsibility that has been difficult to take on, but also very rewarding. I've learned a lot in being thrown into being a war correspondent, but I think that has allowed me to engage with my viewers in a easier dialogue because for me, it is also new. And for many of the viewers that are now tuning in and really starting to understand what's happening in Israel, it's also so new. And so to be able to explain it in a more basic level and try and break it down as simply as possible for such a complex situation, I think that has been one of the benefits, if I had to say there is one, to being thrown into this relatively new since October 7th.
You would say a quick learning curve.
Absolutely a quick learning curve, and you definitely have to sink or swim in this industry. And I've been staying afloat, that's for sure. But it's difficult. I've seen things that I could never imagine seeing, smelling, hearing, but that's part of the job. And although I did not see my career path going this way, I think it's been one of the most beneficial aspects. I've learned so much through it about really what is happening on the ground, seeing it firsthand and being able to then provide that through a lens to our viewers as well, to show this is exactly what is happening on the ground.
Michele, you've got a certain amount of experience behind you. How does this fit into that context?
I have been living and reporting from Israel for about 34 years, maybe 35, as you said. And I have covered wars extensively. I have also been in Bosnia. I was in Bosnia during the war there, and in Sarajevo on a rescue operation. And I've lived through the first and second intifadas and the Gulf War and the 2014 war with Gaza and the Lebanon war. So yes, I have a great deal of experience, but even so, nothing quite prepared me for October 7th. The air raid sirens that were sounding in Jerusalem. We happened to have a bomb shelter right next to my office, and that was very reassuring. But within 2 hours, one of our sons was called up by the IDF. And so this was not only a journalistic experience, this was the experience of our lives. And then within a very short period of time, we discovered that someone we care very much about was murdered on October 7th. And we know we are 1 degree away from maybe 5 people who've been killed even in the past couple of weeks. So the challenge for me has been to balance my journalism with my life. I have a great deal of experience. I know a great deal about the history of Hamas, and I've been to Gaza many times. So one of the things I really want to do when I'm reporting is to give context. I'm seeing a lot of garbage coming out of the reporting here, but I really know the region, and I really know it because I've lived through it and I've covered it and I've reported on it. So I've been careful about who I write for and what. I haven't done a bunch of mass reporting. I've accepted various assignments, but not a great many, from U.S. News and World Report, from Religion News Service, from the National Catholic Register. It's extremely important to me that I explain that Hamas runs the Ministry of Health and that the numbers are not verified and that Hamas does not distinguish between combatants and civilians or between those who were killed or injured in Israeli airstrikes. And of course, there have been many, but also Palestinian rocket fire that went awry. So that's how I've wanted to spend my time, and just trying to be a responsible person and maybe kind of like a senior person at this point.
Well, it seems you've used the same concept that Nicole did. She used the word responsibility. You just used the word responsible. And you sort of feel it's your duty to portray what's happening and not to exaggerate and not to go off course, but to report it as you see it. Hillel, you've now followed one particular location that was grievously hit on October 7th. Tell me how October 7th has had an impact on the manner or the nature of your reporting, and then we'll get into the detail of what you've seen.
I think that anybody who has sensitivity to suffering and to trials, tribulations that people go through in life has to be touched to the core by what Israelis have suffered in this massacre of October the 7th and some of the trauma that's been going on since. The stories just don't end. There are thousands and thousands of people who have been affected who we still are learning about. I'm talking about the family members of the people who have been killed, people who have been kidnapped, people who have been wounded. There is just an endless stream of stories. It's amazing that here we are 2 months and 1 week since the attack, and stories are still coming out. The reporting on the Israeli TV station that I watch pretty regularly has been very, very good in getting at some of the human interest stories, things that I, as a writer and a reader and a consumer of TV news and radio news, have always been drawn to. The people stories, events told through the lenses of people, not just policies, not just dry words on a page that some legislator or staff member comes up with, but the way that people are affected by the events of the day. Those are the things that speak to me the most. Those are the things I'm most drawn to. And so sometimes I'll be watching something on the TV news at night and it'll be kind of glossed over. That particular element will be glossed over, I should say. And to me, that little nugget is a story in itself. And that's what I'll pursue and dig after and dig at to try to unearth that. My sense is that the coverage in Israel, by definition, is going to be much, much stronger and in depth than what you're going to see anywhere else in the world, because it's happening here the same way that any other big event in the world is going to be covered best by the people on the ground locally. So this to Israel is in a way a local story, even though it has national and international ramifications. And so if I look at it that way, I see so much opportunity to tell some of these stories that are just not going to be told if people like me and other journalists who care about these people, if we're not going to tell them, nobody else outside of Israel is going to know about them who doesn't speak Hebrew and follow the Israeli news. And that's a lot of people, even among the Jewish community of the world and of the US in particular. So that's what I kind of see as one of the missions that I can fulfill, which is to get some of these stories before the people who care about what's happening in this country.
It's an interesting concept you just provided. This is a story that has a lot more to do with people and their experiences and what they've suffered and the trauma they've gone through and what is still being unfolded, as compared to something that might go through the politics of a spin doctor or the politics of the politicians. And I think it's a really important distinction you make, the three of you, is that this is about people. Yes, it's about politics, and yes, it's about the region, yes, it's about Iran, and yes, it's about Houthis and insurgencies and all of that. But this is very much the story of people's experiences and their trauma and their suffering. Nicole, you were one of the first to see or experience the Gaza envelope. What could you have been thinking while you were driving there as to what might and then what did confront you?
It's interesting because I can think about it day by day, because October 7th, I was on call. I got called at 6:30 in the morning. My phone was just buzzing nonstop. And when I woke up, I rolled over, I checked my phone. On the one hand, I saw that our work texts, everyone on our group chat was just texting and texting. But on the other hand, I realized my phone was just buzzing nonstop because it was all of the rocket alerts that were happening throughout the South at that time. Later in the day, we saw them in central Israel as well. But I knew I was on call, so I quickly hopped out of bed because I knew any minute I was going to be getting a text from work telling me to head in. But at that point in the day, I still thought, okay, in May, I think was the last round of little rocket flare-ups that we saw. So I had reported on it before. And so I said, okay, you can do this. It came out of nowhere, but you're ready to go see what's down there. But then about an hour later, by the time I'm actually in the car with my cameraman, it's maybe 7:45 on October 7th, as we're driving to the south to go to just one of the houses that we saw had one of these impacts. That's when I also get messages from people at work. Be careful. We're getting videos now, and it's not just rockets. There's terrorists that have infiltrated into southern Israel, sending me videos, the ones that we've all seen at this point, of these terrorists in the back of these pickup trucks, holding their guns, going through these southern communities. And we were driving towards those southern communities. And I think that's when something clicked in me that this is different than anything ever. That was on October 7th. By October 8th and October 9th, I was closer to these communities. It wasn't until October 10th, actually, that the military let any journalists into one of these kibbutz communities. And the first one they let anyone in was kibbutz Kfar Aza. And I was there on October 10th, 3 days after this devastation had happened. And the only reason that they were able to let us in on October 10th rather than October 9th or October 8th is because on October 10th, just earlier in the wee hours before that, is when they had finally, to their best knowledge, finished cleansing the area and eliminating the terrorists of this one kibbutz community. And so immediately after they could, to the best of their ability, eliminate all of those terrorists, they wanted to get the press in there, probably 80 different members of the press from all over the world. And the military knew, even though it's a dangerous situation, we're hoping that we've cleansed the area as best as possible. People need to see what happened here as soon as possible. And I thought that was very interesting also, that as safe as it is, and the military was doing their best to keep all of us safe, they knew it was still dangerous for us to be there, but they wanted to get the word out as quickly as possible and really show journalists what was happening there. And that was one of the most difficult things I've ever experienced. But just seeing the progression from the 7th to now, what are we, the 69th day, 9 weeks into this war, seeing the progression that it's taken has also just been very interesting. Even how the military has reacted to where we're allowed to go and what we're allowed to see. And now if you go into these southern communities, there's a hill overlooking the Gaza Strip, and that's pretty much where all of the journalists are camped out with their cameras. You're not allowed to wander freely like you were on October 7th or 8th, as the military was just trying to gain a grasp of what was happening on the ground. It's secured now, it is fortified, and they're continuing to do their best to protect the journalists and get the story out there.
I've been to the area a couple of times for work to write stories. Within minutes of getting to a big nursery greenhouse operation just a little bit north of Gaza, between Ashkelon and Gaza, there was an alert siren. And I just 5 minutes before met the people I was going to be interviewing that day, some of the people who ran the operation. And we immediately went into one of the offices there, which fortunately was right at the entrance, and sort of wrote that out. It was a room, it was a building made of concrete. So that was okay. But then later on in the day, maybe 6 hours later, when I was actually in one of the greenhouses where I spent most of the day, there was a siren, and there were maybe 12 people in the greenhouse with me, mostly volunteers working to help out because of the departure of many of the foreign farm workers and the Israeli farm workers in reserves, etc. The alert goes off and there's no protection. You're in a greenhouse. You might as well be out in the open sky. You're not protected by anything except the nylon on the top, which is completely worthless. If you're told to cover your head like I'm covering, it's not going to do you any good. If a little piece of metal hits you from thousands of feet up, or if the whole missile hits you, it doesn't matter. You're still a goner. And even though we're lying under tables on top of which were some of the plants, it's also not going to protect you really at all. So you really just say the prayers, think of the people who mean the most to you, and just hope. That's the only thing you can do. There's nothing to do. It's really just fate and belief and hoping that you're not going to be another statistic and that you'll get to live.
I have not been down to the Gaza envelope. I decided consciously not to go down for a couple of reasons. One of which was that everyone else was doing that story. Not that there aren't so many stories to do, but I decided to focus elsewhere. I've done a few policy stories, for example. Yes, with people, I interview actual people, but young Haredi, ultra-Orthodox young men, the fact that they decided to volunteer in the army. I've been to Bethlehem a couple of times recently. I went down to the Dead Sea, where survivors of one of the massacres were very early on, went down and interviewed them and spoke with the families of hostages. Unfortunately, they tell us the stories. For example, one woman, middle-aged woman, she described the fact that her parents, who were, I think, 65 years old, were shot in the head and murdered that morning. And then she also had a brother or a sister, I don't remember at this moment, held hostage, and then spoke to those people.
Hillel said, you hear just day after day these horrific stories. And same, Michele, you're talking about two examples of dozens that I'm sure you've reported on. And that's something that also really struck me about covering this. I remember one day I was in studio interviewing another survivor, interviewing him as he was on Zoom from his hospital bed, talking about how he was one of the security officers who fought off dozens of terrorists. And I remember thinking to myself, it should go viral. This one story, it should be all over the international press. But just as Hillel was saying, working in Israel, we are giving a voice to all of these voices. But the unfortunate part about such a tragedy like this is there's thousands, the tens of thousands of survivor stories, of miracle stories. All of them should be told, and the Israeli media is doing their best to tell them, but it's only going to such a small audience at some point. And that's what also has surprised me, that these voices, each one of them, should be an international sensation when you hear about just the miracles or the acts of heroism that they all did. And that's been disheartening in a sense to see that it's not, but I also know that when there are so many voices, it's hard to make them all amplified.
Not everyone wants to hear it, and especially overseas.
Why do you suppose that's the case?
It is one story of many. There is a disproportionate amount of coverage from Israel, but at the same time, there's Donald Trump, and there's January 6th, and there's the American economy, and Russia and Ukraine. In a sense, we're competing. And in a way, I want that to be the case, because I don't always want Israel to be the center of attention. I don't think that it's healthy for Israel. I don't think it's healthy for anyone that there is an obsession with Israel and Israel's quote unquote war crimes and things. You know, what about Syria? What about Nigeria? What about Sudan? Right now, we warrant this coverage and we want this coverage. But I also think that my editors have a bias, and it's not always a pro-Israel bias. They're not always even-handed, although I've been very fortunate, I have to say. They've been very sensitive, and they've been very careful about how they edit my stories and always allow me to read the edited version. But they have competing stories that they have to cover, and we're just one small piece of the world.
One of the things about this period that we're going through, this crisis that we're going through in Israel, is that with all the pain, and there's no shortage of pain, and it's grief, and it's an actual shock and trauma, it's really very deep, and it's really not going to end anytime soon, in my assessment. But amid all that, there are so many positive dimensions to this. In other words, good comes out of evil. I don't believe that happens all the time, but in this case, there are sufficient examples of that happening that it gives me hope that it's not all darkness and gloom. I'm a realist. I'm not an optimist by nature, but just sort of thinking through some of the stories that I've written, there have been plenty of positive dimensions that lend hope. For example, a story that I did about this man who I visited in the hospital in Tel Aviv a few weeks ago, a man from Thailand, 44 years old, just doing his job as a farmhand in this moshav in the south. And he escaped by the skin of his teeth. He was very nearly killed, burned to death by these terrorists. He ends up in the hospital. He's been in the hospital ever since for more than 2 months and for the foreseeable future until he goes through rehabilitation and he gets out. He doesn't speak any Hebrew, doesn't speak any English. In the middle of Tel Aviv, which he had never been to. When I met him and spoke to him, I asked him, well, in the 4 years that you've been in Israel, what have you seen? He said, I've been outside the farm, the moshav, and I thought I heard him wrong. One of the other Thai men who was there at that point explained, no, he is actually saying he's not been outside that farm or that immediate area. He said, you've not been to Jerusalem? He said, no. He has not been to any religious site, historical sites, anything. But knowing nobody, that itself grabbed the imagination of Israelis. Israelis are very warm people at heart. And the way I found out about this man's existence and just the basics, the absolute basics of what he'd gone through, the fact that he was in the hospital and that he had survived this terror, was that somebody had posted on Facebook. And I said, well, this is amazing. Here's this guy who doesn't know anybody, doesn't know any Hebrew. He's in a terrible, frightening situation in the hospital, let alone what he'd gone through to escape with his life. And the post said that some Israelis had come to see him, and then more Israelis come to see him. So I went to see him, and sure enough, there were several people who had come to see him that day. A woman from a kibbutz brought along 2 of her Thai farmhands who themselves made a particular dish that afternoon, some kind of pork and rice dish or whatever, and brought it to him and brought Thai beer with them. And they sort of held it out, and the man smiled from his hospital bed. And then I saw the carts of food that Israelis had brought for him, cakes and sodas and soy milk and all sorts of things that he knew from his country and things that he would need anyway, bottled water and that kind of thing. So you see the good side of this terrible situation that happened. And there's so many more examples. I wrote about this restaurant in Haifa, a hummus restaurant in the lower part of Haifa, not up on the mountain, sort of in the downtown area, owned by Muslims, top of the line hummus, and just family business from 1936. So almost 100 years, third generation. And early on in the war, the family put on Facebook, in Arabic, I guess, that they were helping soldiers and were preparing food to send to soldiers defending the country. And before you knew it, other Muslims were calling for a boycott of this place. It's heartbreaking that this family had no business for a couple of weeks. Well, before you knew it, word got out. The Jewish Israelis heard about this, and they started patronizing the place en masse, to the extent that when I drove by there on Friday afternoon, they had some outdoor seating, quite a bit of outdoor seating, maybe 10, 15 tables, but they were packed. And I said, well, I'm going to come do a story on Sunday. And I went there, I think it was Sunday morning, and it was again packed. And I started talking to some of the Israelis, almost all Jews, who wanted to support them. Some had patronized the place in the past. They wanted to help this family because they stuck their neck out and they got screwed in the process. They wanted to help them to stay above water and then some. So you see that there are terrible things that happen in the world, financially, physically, and otherwise. And yet there are good people out there who are trying to do the right thing. And those really encourage me when I write these stories. It's not all gloom and doom, thank God.
There are two major topics that most Americans know very little about. The first is the impact this has had on the common Israeli reservist who becomes a soldier, who gets called up and gradually slides into an active fighting force. And then there is this other story, which seems almost impossible to comprehend, this whole issue about hostages that are taken, hostages that are released, and families who have to be happy for those who have family members released, but have a personal hurt because their family member still remains a hostage.
I met families of people who were hostages, and they were all in a large hotel on the Dead Sea. And on the surface was this big, beautiful hotel, the David Hotel at the Dead Sea, and they've got all the amenities. And yet these people, they've just survived a massacre, and many of the people that they knew and they loved had been murdered, and they themselves had escaped the atrocity. And I think 35 of them at the time had family members who were hostages. But then there were people who didn't have family members who were hostages. And I didn't have the heart to delve into it at that point. Perhaps now it's the time. Now we're 9 weeks into this, and many of the hostages are freed, but many more have not been. And to contact people individually from, let's say, a certain kibbutz, and with their permission, to discuss the ones whose family members are still there. How are they dealing with this? One of our neighbors was Hirsch Goldberg, and his family lives very close by. And I thought of talking to them, but I have to say, before I'm a journalist, I'm a human being. And I don't want to cause anyone pain. I think at this point that people would be ready to speak, and the ones who don't want to speak can easily say, no, I just can't. But whoever does that story has to be extremely sensitive. It's not like there's a scab that's starting to heal. I mean, this is raw, and this continues to be raw. It's a terrible thing.
It goes back to the word you used earlier, responsible.
The more I do this, the more I prioritize my humanity, even over my journalism. The ideal and what I strive for is to combine them every step of the way.
I can touch on what you were talking about with the soldiers, because I've spoken to many of them. The majority of the ones who I've spoken to were called up on reserve duty. I remember when I was at one of the kibbutz communities walking through the devastation, we're guided by these soldiers And after one of my live reports, you could hear it in my voice. I was shaking because of just what I was surrounded by. And I took a deep breath after I was done. I gave my microphone back to my cameraman, and one of the soldiers, he came up to me and he said, "Are you okay? It's really heavy out here, I know." And that's when I just broke down, because I said, how is this soldier asking me if I'm okay? He just spent the last 24 hours fighting off the terrorists from this community. I find out later that he left his 5 kids, his wife behind. He's a reserve duty soldier. He left. He doesn't also know that I'm working in Israel, that I'm Jewish. He just sees that I'm a reporter who's hurt by what I'm seeing, and he wants to make sure that I'm okay. And I think that's the mentality of the majority of the soldiers. When I'm asking them, you left your family behind at the drop of a hat. Within 24 hours, we saw 300,000 reservist duties jump into action in both the south and in the north on the border with Lebanon. And all of them did so eagerly. I don't know if that's the right word to say, but so proudly, because they wanted to defend their country. And they know that even by leaving their family, their kids, their friends at home, they're defending their country. I have friends that have been turned down from reserve duty because there were so many that wanted to help out that they got turned out, and now they're volunteering, making food for soldiers, helping out in any way that they can. But I think that's really the mentality for these soldiers, as difficult as it is. And no, it wasn't their first option, that they wanted to jump into action and serve on the front lines and risk their lives. But to them, there was no other option. That is all that they saw was the way forward.
It's very obvious that I-24 intentionally takes reporters and sticks them in the field, puts them up north, puts them in the south, and then within 24 hours, they have you again in the studio running a studio discussion of experts. What does that do for you as a reporter in terms of how you grasp the complexity of what's going on?
It is so helpful because on the one hand, I can be in the field seeing what happens firsthand and hearing the sounds and seeing the smells and really experiencing what a war zone is. But then the next day I'll be in studio and I'm interviewing former generals and colonels and Israeli politicians and people who have been immersed in this for the past at least 40 years of their careers. And they actually have the intelligence and the foresight to explain what it was I was seeing, what it was I was hearing, why this is happening now versus it wasn't happening 2 weeks ago, and just the intelligence behind it. And so I think it gives me a benefit because by being on the ground, I know what questions then I want answered for myself from the people that are more knowledgeable about the topic than I am. And so I think it provides just a more well-rounded coverage of exactly what's happening, because you are seeing everywhere from the intelligence, the political ramifications, hearing from families of the hostages, and then also hearing from reporters like myself who can describe and show what is happening on all of the different borders and arenas of this war.
Hillel, you've looked at Kibbutz Be'eri in great depth. What should someone remember about both your reporting and about what happened in Kibbutz Be'eri in 3 years or 5 years?
I did not go to Kibbutz Be'eri when the massacre was fresh. I went there only last week, so it was a day short of the 2-month mark. So there's a little bit of perspective. The one thing I did not expect to see was a kibbutz that was not physically devastated. I was expecting that from the perimeter fence inward, everything was going to be blackened and burnt and devastated. And it wasn't like that. From the first steps into the grounds of the kibbutz, like a normal kibbutz would look. Some of the main buildings at the front, the roads, etc., the landscaping, everything. And then you go a little bit onward into the residential areas that were targeted by the terrorists, because they kind of had their plan and they went for a certain area, which was where the families were.
What is it that we want to remember from October 7th? What do we want to remember about Kibbutz Be'eri? What do we want to remember about the soldiers who were reserve soldiers who were called up?
In the case of Kibbutz Be'eri, it's really kind of two sides of it. One is the past and one is the future, because so much of Be'eri as it exists today is the past, the tragedy and the devastation that happened on October the 7th. And the theme of my story is the way the kibbutz is looking ahead, or at least certain people on the kibbutz are looking ahead, led by the young adult generation. Right now, the way I see it, based on what I saw, what I heard, what people told me, and what the older generation said in confirming the information that I had gathered, was that they're looking ahead. And there's no way that the kibbutz is at the point now to look ahead in the long term. When are people going to move back? What it's going to look like, the architecture of the new homes that are going to have to be erected, et cetera, et cetera. It's just too soon. They still haven't cleared the devastation that's there, the homes that have been burned and wrecked, and they still have to do that. So it's kind of a mixture. It's a juggling act, combining these two elements in time, the past and the immediate present, and then the immediate present and the future. You can sort of see the overlap. I don't know what's going to last the test of time in 3 years or 5 years. I can only write for what the reality is that I see today. I'm not going to focus too much on what I think the future is going to look like.
What you're writing is a snapshot.
Exactly right. That's exactly what I'm saying.
I'm just a little bit the opposite. I've done some analysis. I'm not giving the analysis. I'm not doing the analysis. I am allowing professionals. For U.S. News and World Report, they wanted to know, well, when will the war be over? I wrote it during the ceasefire. I sent it in exactly when the ceasefire was over. And fortunately, the analysts all agreed that this is going to take time for Israel to be able to do what it needs to do to at least weaken Hamas tremendously. It needs time. But at the same time, the American government and the international community is not interested in what Israel wants. They don't really want Hamas around either, and Israel's doing their dirty work for them. But they are understandably very worried about the 2 million Palestinians, civilians. But how can Israel not injure the civilians? On the one hand, America wants it done quickly by the end of the year, January at the latest. But as we see, going through every tunnel takes a day or two. So where does it leave us?
There's a real misunderstanding about whether you use a calendar or a clock. That's really what it boils down to. Someone somehow feels it's like going into a fast food restaurant and you can order it and then you walk away, but that's not exactly how wars unfold, and that's certainly not how they end.
That's right. And this is a problem because Israel really needs to, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, needs to eradicate Hamas, or at least to weaken it tremendously. At the same time, we do have the issue of the civilians, and they are clashing. These needs are clashing, and Israel needs much more time to do this in a more precise way. And if it doesn't have the time to do it in a more precise way, then it either is not going to do it, or it's going to do it, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of casualties among the Israeli soldiers and the civilians. So personally, I don't see this ending well anytime soon.
How come there was a lack of reporting about what happened to Israeli women on October 7th?
From an international perspective?
Yes.
I wish I knew the answer. I think some of it is foresight, as we are hearing more and more of these stories coming out. It takes a while for some of these victims to share these stories.
Mm-hmm.
So you're hearing from the different forensics teams that are talking about the horrific scenes that they've encountered on just some of the dead bodies. We're talking about women who their pelvis was broken because they were raped so brutally. Horrific acts that are beyond words, yet somehow these medical professionals have to put them in words. So not too long after some of this, we are hearing some of those stories, but I think just now, some of these victims are finally starting to speak out because they are gaining some of the strength. But I think it's difficult, and possibly also it's difficult if they want to share their stories in Hebrew versus in English. It's harder for some of the international press to pick it up because even though you can translate it, it means so much more hearing the emotion in someone's voice, especially if they're talking about something so personal and so traumatic. If you put a dub over my voice or even have the subtitles, it really does help hearing it in your own language and hearing just the emotion behind it. And so I think that could be on the one hand, but on the other hand, I just think people are glancing over this as they have with a lot of the major news stories that have come out of this war. This is just one, unfortunately, of the many other examples that the international media has kind of brushed over because there's other things to talk about, yes, in this war that they are covering, yet that means so many other elements are falling under and not getting the coverage that they deserve.
And the international media is covering it for their home papers so that the coverage is different. As an observer of the international media, I can honestly say the photojournalism of this war, as seen on the American media, is a lot different than the photojournalism that's seen on the Israeli media. You don't see the shots of Gaza that you see on CNN or MSNBC or the American network. There's a different criteria that's used. There's a different set of priorities. And I think probably the people who do the reporting probably also have those similar preferences or biases. I don't know if you can be biased and also be responsible, Michele, but maybe that's the joy of having the three of you on today, is to sort of get the perspective and get the insight and to get the visual shots, which you're writing about, which is so terribly important. And for that, I think everyone on the program today, everyone who watched, is really grateful for the stories that you told and the insights that you provide.